this episode, we start by clearing up two ideas that quietly control everything else you do in PCI work. Who is responsible for what, and what exactly is inside the boundary you are protecting? Beginners often think payment security is mostly about installing the right controls, but in reality, the first big challenge is agreeing on roles and scope so you know which systems, people, and processes the controls must cover. If roles are unclear, tasks get missed because everyone assumes someone else is handling them. If scope is sloppy, you either protect too little and leave real risk exposed, or you protect too much and create a compliance nightmare that drains time and money. Getting this right early makes the rest of the learning feel simpler, because the controls stop being random and start being attached to a well-defined environment. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our Course Companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. To build confidence, you first need a plain language definition of scope because people often treat it like a vague administrative detail. Scope is the set of systems, networks, applications, people, and processes that are considered part of the environment that stores, processes, or transmits cardholder data, plus anything that can impact the security of that environment. That second part matters because it means scope is not only where the data sits, but also what can reach or affect the systems that handle it. A helpful way to think about it is that scope draws a line around what must be protected and assessed, and that line must be defensible with logic, not just preference. When you can explain scope in this way, you are ready to understand why PCI roles exist, because roles describe who owns the work inside and around that boundary. One of the most important roles to understand is the entity that accepts card payments and is responsible for meeting PCI requirements, often called the merchant. A merchant is not defined by company size or industry. It is defined by the fact that it takes payment cards as part of doing business. Even if a merchant uses third parties to handle parts of payment processing, the merchant still has responsibilities because outsourcing a function does not automatically outsource accountability. Beginners sometimes assume that if a company uses a well-known payment platform, everything becomes the provider's problem. But PCI is built around shared responsibility. The merchant must know what parts of the environment they control, what parts the provider controls, and how the connection between them is secured and validated. When you grasp that, scope starts to look less like paperwork and more like a safety boundary the merchant must actively manage. Another foundational role is the service provider, which is any organization that stores, processes, or transmits cardholder data on behalf of another entity, or that can impact the security of a customer's cardholder data environment. That impact language is important because it includes providers that do not handle the data directly but still have meaningful access, such as managed security, hosting, or certain support functions. A service provider is not automatically trustworthy just because they are a vendor, so their responsibilities must be clearly defined and verified. For scope, the key idea is that service providers create extensions of your environment, even if the systems live in their facilities or cloud accounts. You need to understand what parts of the data flow pass through them, what controls they promise to operate, and what evidence exists that those controls are real. This turns vendor relationships into an active security design problem rather than a simple procurement choice. Within PCI discussions, you will also hear about the cardholder data environment, CDE, which is the part of the overall environment where cardholder data is stored, processed, or transmitted. Think of the CDE as the core zone that must be protected most tightly because it directly touches the sensitive data. The CDE is rarely a single server sitting alone. It is usually a set of connected components like payment applications, databases, network segments, and management systems that support them. Beginners sometimes picture the CDE as only the payment terminal or only the website checkout page, but the definition includes any system that participates in handling the data. If you do not identify the true CDE, you will misunderstand where controls apply and what evidence matters. Getting comfortable with the CDE concept is the foundation for later topics like segmentation, tokenization, and scope reduction. Closely connected to the CDE is the idea of connected to and could impact systems, which is where scope often expands beyond what beginners expect. A connected to system is one that has direct connectivity to the CDE, such as a system on the same network segment, a management workstation that can log into CDE servers, or a logging platform that receives data from CDE systems. A could impact system is one that can affect the security of the CDE even if it does not store cardholder data, such as identity systems, vulnerability management tools, or administrative access pathways. The reason this matters is that attackers often do not start inside the CDE. They start elsewhere and move toward it through trust relationships. PCI Scope tries to account for that reality by making you include systems that can influence the security of the CDE. When you can explain this in plain language, you can understand why scoping conversations often feel more like threat modeling than like inventory management. A role that helps clarify responsibility is the assessor, and you can think of this as the person or team verifying that requirements are met and evidence is sufficient. Depending on context, an assessment might be performed by a qualified internal team or by an external assessor, but the key is that the assessor's job is to evaluate, not to build. Beginners sometimes imagine assessors as people who simply check boxes, but a competent assessor is evaluating whether controls achieve their intent and whether the scope is defined correctly. This is why precise scope matters so much, because assessment results are only meaningful if the boundary is accurate. If you exclude something that should be in scope, you can look compliant on paper while remaining exposed in reality. Understanding the assessor role helps you anticipate the kind of questions a good assessment process will ask, such as how you determine scope and what proof supports that decision. Once you understand the main roles, you can see why the word ownership shows up so often in PCI conversations. Ownership is not just who bought a system. It is who has the authority and responsibility to make security decisions about it. For example, a merchant might own a payment application but rely on a hosting provider to manage the underlying servers, while a managed security provider monitors alerts. In that situation, responsibilities are split across parties, but gaps can form if the split is not explicit. A realistic scoping approach assigns ownership for each system and each security control, so there is no ambiguity about who maintains, who monitors, who patches, and who produces evidence. This is also why contracts and service descriptions matter, because they define what the provider will do and what the merchant must still do. Clear ownership turns PCI from a confusing web of tasks into a set of accountable responsibilities. Now it helps to walk through how scope is actually determined at a high level, because beginners sometimes think there is a single correct diagram that every company should use. In reality, scoping is an investigative process where you start with where cardholder data enters the environment, then trace everywhere it goes, and then identify what systems touch it directly or indirectly. You also look at administrative access paths, because systems that can administer the CDE can impact it even if they do not handle the data. You include supporting services like identity, logging, and time synchronization when they are necessary for secure operations, because weakening them can weaken the CDE. Finally, you document the boundary and the logic behind it so it can be reviewed, challenged, and improved. That last part is crucial because scope must be defendable, not just assumed. A common scoping misconception is believing that if you never store cardholder data, your scope becomes tiny or disappears entirely. Not storing data can reduce scope, but processing and transmitting still count, and so do the systems that support those activities. Another misconception is believing that a single control, like network segmentation, automatically removes systems from scope just because someone says it does. Segmentation can reduce scope only when it is designed correctly and validated with evidence. And that validation becomes part of the story you must be able to explain. Beginners also sometimes confuse cardholder data with payment-related information that is not the same thing, and that confusion can cause both overscoping and underscoping. The safest approach is to be precise about what data elements you are talking about and to treat assumptions as risks until they are verified. When you correct these misconceptions early, your later learning becomes cleaner because the definitions stop shifting under your feet. Scope also needs to be revisited regularly because environments change in ways that can quietly expand or shift the boundary. A new integration, a new support vendor, a new remote access method, or even a change in how logs are centralized can alter what is connected to or could impact the CDE. Beginners sometimes treat scope as a one-time project, but in a real organization it behaves more like a living map that must be updated as the landscape changes. This is why change management, documentation, and communication become security tools, because they prevent accidental drift where the CDE grows without anyone noticing. Even for exam purposes, it helps to think of scope as dynamic, because many test questions are designed around the idea that yesterday's scope decision might be wrong today due to a change. When you can reason about scope over time, you are thinking the way PCI expects you to think. Another piece of confidence is being able to describe what good scoping evidence looks like, without getting lost in implementation detail. Good evidence often includes clear diagrams of data flow, network boundaries, and system inventories that show which components are in scope and why. It also includes explanations of administrative access, such as which identity systems and management workstations can reach the CDE, because those paths matter for security. Vendor responsibility documentation is also part of evidence, because it shows what the service provider is responsible for and what the merchant is responsible for, reducing ambiguity. The key is that evidence should tell a coherent story, where the boundary makes sense given where the data goes and how systems can influence it. If evidence is inconsistent or incomplete, scope becomes hard to defend, and that is exactly where risk hides. By the end of this lesson, the big idea is that PCI roles and scope are not separate topics, because roles determine who must do the work and scope determines where the work must be done. Merchants, service providers, and assessors each view the environment through a slightly different lens, but they all rely on the same fundamental definitions of where cardholder data exists and what can impact its security. When you can define the CDE, explain connected to and could impact systems, and describe shared responsibility without hand-waving, you have a strong foundation for every other objective in this series. Precise scope is what makes later topics like segmentation, tokenization, encryption, and access control meaningful instead of abstract. If you build the habit of defending scope with logic and evidence, you will not only be better prepared for exam questions, you will also be thinking in the disciplined way that payment security expects.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.